A circle of navy suits pinned the waitress flat against the oak table, their fingers pointing like accusers at a witch trial, their phones filming her final humiliation. But when the tattooed giant in the white shirt stepped through the doorway and locked it behind him, the laughter died in their throats. What he did to them in the next 9 minutes didn't just end a crime. It became the reason Julian Hargrave's family spent $250,000 trying to erase every witness, every camera, every whisper of what truly happens when you touch what belongs to Antonio Ramirez. If you're ready to see what happens when a bully picks the wrong night and the wrong room, go ahead and subscribe and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It's always incredible to see this community grow. Plus, I've got another story dropping tomorrow that'll make this one look tame. Alright, back to the story. The smell inside the Velvet Lounge was always the same. Black cherry tobacco, aged leather, and the faint metallic tang of old money meeting new sin. It was the kind of place that existed in the cracks of the city, where the velvet ropes kept out the desperate, and the chandeliers hung low enough to make even senators whisper. The jazz was live, the bourbon was double-barreled, and the staff knew to smile with their mouths closed. But tonight, the back room smelled wrong. It didn't smell like cigars and champagne. It smelled like fear, sweat, and broken cologne bottles, sharp and sour, the way a room smells when men forget there are consequences. Stacy Michaels had been wiping down the polished oak bar for 10 minutes, her hands moving in tight, mechanical circles even though the wood was already spotless. She was 26, but under the amber pendant lights with her blonde hair pulled into a practical low ponytail and her white button-down shirt starched stiff as armor, she looked like someone playing dress-up in her mother's uniform. She looked like someone who'd learned to make herself small. She kept her eyes down, tracking the grain in the wood, avoiding the gaze of the regulars scattered across the main floor. Mr. Chen, in his usual corner booth. The couple by the window who never ordered food. The man in the white shirt at the back table who never spoke but whose presence made the room feel like it was holding its breath. She needed this shift. The private backroom service paid triple. Triple meant 3 months closer to clearing her father's debts. Triple meant she could stop answering calls from men with polite voices and impolite intentions. So when the manager pointed toward the VIP hallway and mouthed, "They requested you specifically," Stacy grabbed the tray of champagne flutes, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the door with the brass lock and the velvet curtain. She needed this job. She needed it so badly she ignored the way her hands started shaking the moment she heard the lock click behind her. The Velvet Lounge didn't advertise. It didn't need to. The kind of people who belonged there already knew where to find it. Tucked behind an unmarked door on 7th Street, where the cobblestones still remembered horse carriages and the street lamps cast shadows that moved wrong. Inside, the world split into 2 versions of itself. The main floor, where corporate lawyers and trust fund kids pretended they were dangerous, and the back room, where the pretending stopped. Stacy had worked the main floor for 3 weeks. Good tips, safe tips. Men who undressed her with their eyes but kept their hands on their glasses. She'd learned to smile with her teeth hidden, to laugh at jokes that weren't funny, to disappear the moment a hand reached for her wrist. Survival skills, the same ones that kept her alive when the landlord came knocking, when her father's bookie sent flowers with threats written on the cards, when the electricity company stopped accepting promises. The back room was different. The back room was a week's rent in a single night. Maybe 2 if they were drunk enough and felt generous. That's what Sarah, the day shift manager, told her. Just keep the glasses full, keep your mouth shut, and don't react when they get loud. Rich men pay more when they think they're shocking you. Stacy needed shocking money. She needed so much money that her hands had stopped shaking when she looked at her bank account and started shaking when she looked at the calendar instead. So when the front door opened at exactly 9:47 and 6 men in suits that cost more than her car walked in like they owned the oxygen itself, Stacy didn't look away. She watched them the way a deer watches headlights, frozen but focused. The one in front wore a navy vest over a white shirt, his hair gelled into corporate perfection, his smile the kind that never reached his eyes. He moved like someone who'd never been told no, his hand already reaching for his phone, his laugh too loud for the jazz quartet in the corner. "We need the back room," he announced to no one and everyone, his voice cutting through the cigarette smoke and whispered conversations. The one with the table, the big one. The manager appeared from behind the bar, his face professionally blank. "Mr. Hargrave, of course. Right this way. Julian." His name was Julian Hargrave, and Stacy knew that name. Everyone in the service industry knew that name. Old money, political money, the kind of family that had buildings named after them and scandals buried under them. And her, Julian added, pointing directly at Stacy without looking at her face. "We want her." The manager's eyes found hers across the room. There was an apology in them, buried under practicality and rent checks, and the unspoken reality that waitresses were replaceable and Hargrave money was not. Stacy picked up the tray of champagne. Her reflection in the polished silver looked like a stranger. She followed them toward the hallway where the velvet curtain hung like a mouth. The back room smelled like expensive mistakes. Cigar smoke layered thick enough to taste, cologne that cost more per ounce than Stacy made in a day, and underneath it all, the sour-sweet stink of men who believed the world was a buffet designed specifically for their appetites. The oak table dominated the center of the room, its surface polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the amber light from the Tiffany lamps overhead. It was beautiful in the way a guillotine was beautiful. Functional, final. Julian dropped into the leather chair at the head of the table like a king claiming his throne. His 5 friends arranged themselves around him, a constellation of navy suits and smirking mouths, their ties loosened, their eyes bright with the kind of cruelty that only comes from never facing consequences. They looked like they'd stepped out of a yacht club brochure. Clean jawlines, perfect teeth, the kind of men whose fathers made problems disappear with phone calls. "Champagne," Julian said, snapping his fingers without looking at her. "And keep it coming. We're celebrating." Stacy moved to the sidebar where the bottles waited in their silver buckets, her hands steady despite the way her pulse hammered in her throat. She'd done this before. She could do it again. Smile. Pour. Disappear into the wallpaper. Collect the money. Go home. Pay the debt. Survive another month. She filled the first glass, then the second. Julian's friends were already loud, their laughter jagged and performative, the kind of noise men make when they're trying to impress each other. They talked about stock portfolios and vacation homes and women they'd bedded like trophies they'd mounted. Stacy kept her face neutral, her eyes down, her body language closed, invisible. For the first hour, it worked. Julian drank fast. His friends matched him glass for glass, their voices climbing in volume, their jokes getting crueler. They mocked the waiter from their last club. They mocked the valet who drove too slow. They mocked Julian's ex-girlfriend, passing around a phone with photos they shouldn't have had, laughing at angles and moments that belonged in darkness, not in the light of their screens. Stacy refilled glasses. She said nothing. She was furniture. "You know what I love about places like this?" Julian said suddenly, his eyes finally landing on her. They were gray, she noticed, the color of dirty ice. The service. You ask for something, and it just appears, like magic. Like these girls are programmed to obey. His friends laughed. One of them, a man with slicked back hair and a watch that caught the light like a warning, raised his glass. To obedience. They drank. Stacy felt her stomach turn. "Hey," Julian said, his voice sharper now. "Come here." Stacy approached. She kept her tray between them like a shield. Closer. She took one step, then another. Julian reached out and plucked the tray from her hands, setting it on the table with a carelessness that made the glasses rattle. His fingers were cold when they wrapped around her wrist. "You've been so quiet," he said, pulling her closer. "Don't you talk? Or are you one of those girls who just smiles and takes it?" The room laughed. It wasn't funny, but they laughed anyway, their voices overlapping into a single sound, like hyenas circling something wounded. "I'm just here to serve drinks, sir," Stacy said, her voice carefully polite, carefully neutral. "If you need anything else, we need you to relax," Julian interrupted, his grip tightening. "You're so tense. It's making us uncomfortable." "Isn't she making us uncomfortable?" A chorus of agreement. One of them pulled out his phone. The camera light blinked red. Stacy's heart kicked into a different rhythm. Survival rhythm. The one that screamed run, but her body had learned a different lesson years ago. Freezing kept you safe. Fighting got you hurt worse. So she froze. "Let go, please," she said quietly. Julian smiled. It was the worst thing she'd ever seen. "Or what?" He yanked her forward. She stumbled, her hips slamming into the edge of the table. Before she could recover, Julian's other hand was on her shoulder, pushing down, forcing her back against the polished wood. The surface was cold against her spine. The chandelier overhead swam in her vision. "See?" Julian said to his friends, his voice bright with triumph. "This is what I'm talking about. You pay enough, you can do whatever you want. That's the beauty of capitalism." His friends closed in. Not to help, not to stop him, to watch, to film. One of them pointed at her face, laughing at the expression she couldn't control. Another one made a comment about her shirt, about the way the buttons strained when Julian pressed down harder. The man with the slicked hair raised his glass like he was toasting a show. Stacy tried to push up. Julian's hand moved to her throat. Not choking, just holding, just reminding her that he could. "Please," she whispered. The word tasted like shame. "Please what?" Julian leaned closer. His breath smelled like champagne and rot. "Please more? Please harder?" "You have to be specific, sweetheart. We're paying for a service here." The phones angled for better shots. The laughter got louder. Someone suggested they take a photo for Julian's Instagram. Just blur her face. No one would know. Someone else said they should make her drink from the bottle, make her beg for her tip. The suggestions piled on top of each other, each one worse than the last. And Stacy realized with a clarity that felt like drowning that no one was coming to help her. The manager wouldn't check on them. The other waitresses wouldn't interrupt. The world outside this room didn't care what happened to girls like her in rooms like this. Julian's hand moved from her throat to her collar. His fingers hooked under the fabric. And that's when the lock clicked. Not from the inside. From the outside. The sound cut through the laughter like a blade through silk. Every head turned toward the door. Every phone lowered. The room held its breath. The door opened slowly, deliberately, and Antonio Ramirez stepped into the frame. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He was 6'4" of tattooed violence in a white button-down shirt rolled to the elbows, his forearms covered in ink that looked like it had been carved rather than drawn. His jaw was set. His eyes were black and empty and promised the kind of pain that left permanent marks on the soul, not just the body. He looked at Stacy on the table, at Julian's hand on her collar, at the phone still recording. Then he looked at Julian, and he closed the door behind him, and he locked it. If you can't stand cowards who laugh while someone else is being hurt, hit that subscribe button. The silence that followed the lock's click wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of prey animals realizing the forest had gone quiet because something apex had arrived. It was the silence of men who'd spent their entire lives insulated from violence suddenly understanding, on a molecular level, what violence actually looked like when it had a name and a face and walked on two legs. Antonio Ramirez didn't rush. He didn't need to. He moved into the room the way a storm front moves across open water, inevitable, unhurried, and absolutely certain of its destination. He was massive in a way that had nothing to do with height alone, though he had plenty of that. It was the way he occupied space, the way his presence pushed all the oxygen to the edges of the room and replaced it with something heavier, something that tasted like iron and old consequences. His white shirt was pristine, tailored to fit shoulders that looked like they'd been carved from oak and patience. The sleeves were rolled precisely to his elbows, exposing forearms that told stories in ink and scar tissue. The tattoos weren't decorative. They weren't the kind of designs college kids picked off a wall after 3 beers. These were earned. A serpent coiled around his right forearm, its scales so detailed they seemed to shift in the amber light, its mouth open in a strike that never landed. On his left arm, a series of names in script so small Stacy couldn't read them from the table. But she understood what they meant. Debts paid, debts owed, the permanent ledger of a man who kept accounts written in skin. His hands hung loose at his sides, but there was nothing relaxed about them. They were working hands, scarred knuckles, calluses in places that told you he'd broken things professionally and often. His neck was thick, corded with muscle that disappeared into the collar of his shirt, and just visible above the fabric was the edge of another tattoo, something that looked like Latin, or maybe a prayer, or maybe both. But it was his face that made Julian's hand finally release Stacy's collar. Antonio had the kind of face that belonged on ancient coins. Roman severity, sharp cheekbones that could cut glass, a jaw that looked like it had been set in concrete since birth and never softened. His nose had been broken at least twice, reset wrong both times, giving him a profile that said he'd survived things that would have killed softer men. His eyes were dark, so dark the pupils disappeared into the iris, and they carried the weight of every violent thing he'd ever witnessed or caused. They weren't angry eyes. They were worse. They were accounting eyes. The eyes of a man doing math in his head, calculating exactly how much pain was owed and planning the most efficient route to collect it. He looked at Julian first. Just looked, didn't speak, didn't threaten. Just catalogued him the way a butcher catalogues a carcass, deciding which cuts to make first. Julian's hand dropped from Stacy's collar like he'd touched fire. He took a step back, then caught himself, his face flushing red with the effort of pretending he wasn't terrified. Who the hell are you? This is a private. Antonio's gaze shifted to the man with the phone. The one still recording. The man's hand started shaking so badly the image on the screen blurred. He lowered the device, then he turned it off, then he put it in his pocket like it might explode if he didn't handle it gently enough. The man with the slicked hair cleared his throat. Listen, we're customers here. We paid for. Antonio looked at him. Just that. Just shifted his eyes 6 inches to the left. The man's mouth clicked shut so fast, Stacy heard his teeth connect. The room had gone from raucous celebration to funeral parlor in under 30 seconds. The jazz from the main floor filtered through the walls, distant and inappropriate, like music playing in a nightmare. One of Julian's friends, the youngest one with the fresh MBA and the nervous laugh, took a half step toward the door. Antonio didn't move, didn't even turn his head. But something in the air shifted. The young man stopped moving. He looked like he might cry. Julian tried again, his voice pitched higher than before, the confident veneer cracking at the edges. Do you know who I am? Do you know who my father? Yes, Antonio said. It was the first word he'd spoken since entering the room. His voice was low, textured like gravel rolling in a barrel. And it carried the kind of authority that made everything else, the music, the breathing, the sound of 6 men's hearts hammering in their chests seem like background noise. That single syllable contained more threat than Julian's entire speech about capitalism and obedience. Antonio took 3 steps forward. Each footfall was measured, deliberate, the sound of his shoes against the hardwood like a judge's gavel. He stopped at the edge of the table where Stacy still lay frozen, her white shirt wrinkled, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He didn't look down at her yet. He kept his eyes on the men who'd put her there. The pointing fingers that had been aimed at Stacy like accusations, like mockery, like weapons made of privilege and cruelty, every single one of them dropped. Hands disappeared into pockets. Arms crossed over chests. Bodies turned slightly away. The universal body language of animals trying to make themselves smaller, trying to signal submission without saying the words. Antonio's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped near his ear. It was the only sign that what he felt inside wasn't the same ice-cold control he projected outside. He looked at the table. At the champagne flutes knocked over in the struggle. At the phone, one of them had dropped, its screen still showing the photo gallery. Thumbnails of Stacy's face twisted in fear. He reached down without looking and picked up the phone. The man who owned it made a small sound in his throat, something between a protest and a whimper. Antonio closed his fist around the device. The screen spiderwebbed, plastic cracked, glass crunched. He opened his hand and let the pieces fall to the floor like snow. Everybody out, Antonio said quietly. Nobody moved. Not because they didn't want to, because they couldn't. Fear had turned their legs to concrete. Antonio turned his head slowly, taking in each face, memorizing features the way a predator memorizes territory. His eyes lingered on Julian last. Everybody, he repeated. And this time his voice dropped half an octave. Except you. That broke the spell. The 5 friends scrambled for the door like drowning men reaching for air. They shoved each other. They tripped. One of them apologized to the doorframe when he ran into it. They didn't look back. They didn't retrieve their jackets or their watches or their dignity. They just ran. The door slammed shut behind them. The sound echoed in the sudden emptiness. And then there were 3 people left in the room. Stacy on the table, trying to remember how to move. Julian, standing frozen against the leather chair, his face drained of color. And Antonio, standing between them like a wall built from violence and old promises. He finally looked down at Stacy. His expression softened, just barely, just enough that she could see the human beneath the monster everyone else saw. "Can you stand?" he asked. His voice was different when he spoke to her, gentler, the voice of someone asking permission instead of giving orders. Stacy nodded. Her throat felt like it had been lined with sandpaper. She pushed herself up on her elbows, her white shirt twisted and damp with sweat that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Antonio stepped back, giving her space, his eyes never leaving Julian. That's when Julian made his mistake. Maybe it was the adrenaline. Maybe it was the cocaine he'd snorted in the bathroom an hour ago finally catching up with his judgment. Maybe it was simply that men like Julian had spent so long believing they were untouchable, that the concept of consequences had become theoretical, academic, something that happened to other people in other tax brackets. Whatever the reason, instead of staying silent, instead of reading the room and understanding that his only path to survival was complete submission, Julian opened his mouth. "You're going to regret this," he said, his voice shaking but defiant. My father owns half this city. By tomorrow this shithole will be condemned. By next week, you'll be answering questions in rooms with no windows. You think you're scary? You're nothing. You're a thug with a gym membership and some tacky ink. I'm a Hargrave. Antonio tilted his head slightly, like he was listening to a child explain why vegetables were unfair. Then he moved. It wasn't fast the way movie fights are fast. It was fast the way accidents are fast. The way a car hits a telephone pole or a bone breaks or a heart stops. One moment Antonio was standing still, and the next his fist was buried in Julian's stomach, so deep, Stacy heard the air evacuate his lungs in a single, wet gasp. Julian folded forward like paper. Antonio caught him by the vest, held him upright, and drove his knee into Julian's face. The sound was terrible. Cartilage giving way, blood spattering across white shirt fabric. Julian's legs went liquid. Antonio let him drop. He didn't stop there. This wasn't anger. Anger was hot and chaotic and made mistakes. This was surgery. Antonio dragged Julian back to his feet by his collar and drove him backward into the oak table, the same table where Stacy had been pinned minutes ago. Julian's spine hit the edge, and something in him made a sound like green wood cracking. Antonio pressed him down, one hand flat against Julian's chest, the other pulling back for another strike. Wait, Julian choked out, blood streaming from his broken nose, his hands raised in surrender. Wait, please, I'm sorry, Antonio hit him again, this time in the ribs. Once, twice, 3 times with mechanical precision, each impact placed exactly where it would hurt most. Break quickest, leave the longest reminder. Julian tried to scream but couldn't get enough air. He wheezed instead, a high, thin sound that made him seem smaller than he'd ever been. The door burst open. 2 men in dark suits rushed in, thick-necked and gym-heavy, the kind of private security that rich families kept on retainer for situations exactly like this. They must have been waiting in the hallway, must have heard the commotion and decided their paycheck was worth the risk. The first one reached for Antonio's shoulder. Antonio spun, impossibly fast for someone his size, and caught the man's wrist mid-grab. He twisted. The bodyguard's arm bent in a direction arms weren't designed to bend. The pop was audible. The bodyguard screamed and dropped to his knees. The second bodyguard was smarter. He went for a weapon, his hand reaching inside his jacket toward what was probably a taser or pepper spray, or maybe something more permanent. He never reached it. Antonio released the first man and closed the distance in 2 strides. His elbow came up and caught the second bodyguard under the jaw with enough force to lift him off his feet. The man's head snapped back. His eyes rolled white. He hit the floor and didn't move. The first bodyguard, still cradling his broken wrist, tried to scramble toward the door on his knees. Antonio stepped on his ankle. Not hard enough to break it, just hard enough to pin him there, like a butterfly under glass. Stay, Antonio said. The bodyguard stayed. Antonio turned back to Julian, who was trying to slide off the table, leaving a smear of blood across the polished oak. Antonio grabbed him by the vest again, yanked him upright, and walked him backward until Julian's shoulders hit the wall. The Tiffany lamp overhead swayed from the impact. You put your hands on her, Antonio said quietly, his face inches from Julian's. In my establishment, at my table, while I was sitting 30 feet away. He pressed harder. Julian's feet left the floor. That's not business. That's not a transaction. That's you telling me you don't respect what I built, that you think my protection means nothing, that the women who work for me are yours to break. Julian tried to speak. Antonio squeezed his throat, cutting off the words. I don't negotiate with people who think like you, Antonio continued, his voice never rising above conversational volume. I don't debate. I don't give second chances. I teach lessons that last. He pulled Julian forward and then slammed him back against the wall. Once. Twice. 3 times. The plaster cracked. Julian's eyes glazed over, his body going limp, held upright only by Antonio's grip. Then Antonio stopped. He let Julian slide down the wall until he was sitting in a heap, his expensive vest torn, his white shirt painted red, his face already swelling into shapes that would take months to heal and years to forget. Antonio stepped back, rolled his shoulders like he was loosening up after a light workout, and straightened his shirt cuffs. His knuckles were bloody, his breathing was even. He looked at the bodyguard still pinned under his foot, then lifted it slowly. The man didn't move, didn't even look up. Get him out of my club, Antonio said. Take him to a hospital. Tell them he fell downstairs. Tell them whatever story you think will stick. But if I see him in this building again, If I see any of you in this building again, I won't use my hands. I'll use tools. And nobody will find enough pieces to identify. Understand?" The bodyguard nodded so hard his neck made clicking sounds. Antonio turned away from them like they'd already ceased to exist. He walked to where Stacy still sat on the edge of the table, her hands clutching the wood, her eyes wide and unfocused. She was shaking. Not crying, not yet, but trembling like a leaf in wind she couldn't see. Antonio shrugged out of his jacket. It was expensive, tailored, the kind of garment that probably cost what Stacy made in 2 months. He draped it over her shoulders without a word, the fabric still warm from his body, smelling like cedar and something darker, something that might have been gunpowder or might have been blood from old fights. "You're safe now," he said, and his voice had gone back to that gentler register, the one he'd used when he asked if she could stand. "Nobody touches what's mine. Nobody." Stacy looked up at him, really looked, past the tattoos and the violence and the blood on his knuckles. She saw something in his eyes that didn't match the brutality she'd just witnessed. Protection. Not possession. Protection. "Thank you," she whispered. Antonio shook his head slightly. "Don't thank me for doing what should have been done the moment they locked that door. Thank me by never letting anyone make you feel like you deserved that. You didn't. You don't. You never will." Behind them, the bodyguards were dragging Julian toward the exit, leaving a trail across the hardwood that the cleaning crew would spend hours scrubbing. Antonio didn't watch them go. He kept his eyes on Stacy, waiting until the shaking stopped, until her breathing evened out, until she looked less like someone drowning and more like someone who'd just touched dry land. "Can you walk?" he asked. She tested her legs. They held. Barely, but they held. "I think so." "Good. Come on. I'll take you somewhere safe, somewhere they'll never find you." And because she had nowhere else to go, because the world outside this room still didn't care about girls like her, because the man who'd just broken 3 people in under 2 minutes was somehow the only person who'd ever asked if she was okay, Stacy stood up, pulled his jacket tighter around her shoulders, and followed Antonio Ramirez out of the room where she'd almost died. The door closed behind them, the velvet curtain fell back into place, and in the empty back room, the only sound was the jazz still playing from the main floor and the slow drip of blood hitting polished oak. The ambulance arrived 18 minutes later. Stacy watched from the window of Antonio's upstairs office as the paramedics loaded Julian onto a stretcher, his face covered in gauze that was already soaking through red. His friends stood in a cluster on the sidewalk, their phones out, their voices carrying up through the night air. They were angry now that they were outside, now that they had distance and cell service and the comforting illusion that consequences were negotiable if you had the right last name. Julian lifted his hand as they were sliding him into the ambulance. Not to wave, to point. His finger aimed directly at the club's entrance, shaking with fury or pain or both. His mouth moved behind the oxygen mask. Stacy couldn't hear the words, but she understood the shape of them. Threats, promises, the kind of declarations men make when they've lost a battle but still believe they'll win the war. Antonio stood beside her, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He'd washed the blood off his knuckles in the sink, changed his shirt to a fresh black one that made him look like a shadow with a pulse. "He'll come back," Antonio said quietly. "Not himself. He's learned that lesson. But his family, his father, they'll come." "What will they do?" Stacy asked. Her voice sounded small in the large office. "Everything they can. Everything money can buy." Antonio moved away from the window and sat on the edge of his desk, his hands resting on his knees. The Hargraves don't fight with fists. They fight with lawyers and politicians and permits that suddenly get denied. They fight with building inspectors who find violations that weren't there yesterday. They fight with liquor licenses that mysteriously disappear and health codes that get rewritten overnight. "So we already lost." "No," Antonio said, and there was something in his voice that made Stacy look at him. "We just moved to a different kind of battlefield. One I've been fighting on longer than Julian's been alive." The police arrived 23 minutes after the ambulance left. 3 squad cars, their lights painting the street in rotating blues and reds. Stacy's stomach dropped when she saw them. This was it. This was the moment when reality caught up with the fairy tale. Antonio had protected her, yes, but the law didn't care about context. The law would see a man beaten unconscious and want someone to blame. "Stay here," Antonio said, already moving toward the door. "They'll arrest you. Maybe." He paused, looked back at her. "But they won't touch you. That's what matters." He left. Stacy pressed her face against the window, watching as Antonio met the officers at the front entrance. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could read the body language. The lead officer, a thick-shouldered man with gray at his temples, was doing most of the talking. His hands moved in the universal gestures of authority, pointing, demanding, threatening consequences. Antonio stood still, his arms loose at his sides, his posture relaxed but ready. He said something. The officer's face darkened. Then a black town car pulled up. German luxury, the kind that cost 6 figures and came with a driver who knew how to be invisible. The back door opened, and a man stepped out. Even from this distance, even in the dark, Stacy recognized the resemblance. Same sharp jaw as Julian, same gray eyes, but older, harder, with the kind of face that had spent decades making problems disappear. Richard Hargrave, Julian's father. He walked directly to the lead officer, bypassing Antonio entirely like he wasn't worth acknowledging. He handed the officer something. A folder. Papers. Stacy saw the officer open it, scan the contents, and his entire demeanor shifted. The aggressive stance softened. The pointing finger dropped. He nodded. Once. Twice. Then he turned to his fellow officers and made a gesture that meant, "Pack it up. We're done here." Antonio said something. Sharp, brief. The officer ignored him. Richard Hargrave finally looked at Antonio then. And even from 3 stories up, Stacy felt the contempt in that gaze. He said something that made Antonio's jaw tighten. Then Hargrave climbed back into his town car and left, the police cars following him like an escort. Antonio stood alone on the sidewalk for a long moment. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Then he walked back inside. When he returned to the office, his face was stone. "They're not pursuing charges," he said. "Against Julian. Against his friends. Against anyone except potentially me." What did he give them? Statements. Signed statements from Julian's friends saying I attacked them unprovoked. Saying you were in on it. That you lured them to the back room so I could rob them. They're claiming the whole thing was a setup. Stacy felt the floor tilt beneath her. "That's not true. I know what they were doing. You know what they were doing. But the law doesn't care what we know. It cares what can be proven. And right now, it's 6 statements against 2. 6 men from families with lawyers on retainer and judges who owe them favors, against a mafia boss and a waitress with a criminal father." The words hit like a slap. "How do you know about my father?" "I know everything about everyone who works for me," Antonio said, not unkindly. "Your father's gambling debts, your mother's medical bills. The reason you're working triple shifts at a place like this, instead of using that economics degree you earned. I know you're 3 months behind on rent and that your landlord has already started eviction proceedings. I know you're drowning, Stacy. That's why I hired you. Because people who are drowning work harder, stay longer, and don't ask questions." Stacy felt tears prick her eyes. Not from sadness. From rage. "So you exploited me?" "Yes." He didn't flinch from it. "And then I protected you." "Both things are true. And now what? Now the police are going to arrest me for something I didn't do?" "No," Antonio said firmly. "That's where it stops. Hargrave wants a war. He'll get one. But you're not a casualty. You're under my protection now. That means you don't go home. You don't go to your apartment. You don't contact anyone from your old life until this is resolved. You're asking me to disappear. I'm asking you to survive." He moved closer, his voice dropping. "Richard Hargrave just paid off those cops with paperwork that probably included a check with more zeros than you've ever seen. The law failed you tonight, Stacy. It looked at what his son did to you and decided it didn't matter because he has money and you don't. That's the truth. That's how the system works when you're not one of them." Stacy wrapped Antonio's jacket tighter around her shoulders. It still smelled like him. Like cedar and violence, and the only person who'd stood between her and hell. "So what do? We make them regret starting this fight." Antonio's eyes hardened into something that reminded Stacy of obsidian, black glass sharp enough to cut. "They think money is power. I'm going to teach them the same lesson I taught Julian. That there are some things money can't buy. Like safety. Like sleep. Like the certainty that tomorrow will come and you'll still be whole." Outside, the street had gone quiet. The police lights were gone. The ambulance was gone. Julian was gone. But his threat remained, hanging in the air like smoke from a fire that hadn't been put out, just relocated. Stacy looked at Antonio. At this tattooed giant who'd broken 3 men to save her, who'd just told her he'd exploited her desperation and protected her life in the same breath, who was now promising her a war she hadn't asked for against enemies she couldn't beat. "What if we lose?" she asked quietly. Antonio smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Then we'll lose together. But we won't. Because men like Richard Hargrave have never fought someone like me. They've bought their way out of problems. They've negotiated. They've settled. But they've never faced someone who can't be bought, can't be threatened, and doesn't care if the whole city burns as long as justice gets served." He offered his hand. "You're not alone anymore, Stacy. That's the only promise I can make, but it's one I've never broken." Stacy looked at his scarred knuckles, at the hand that had shattered bones an hour ago and was now extended in protection. She thought about the police walking away, about Julian's pointing finger, about 6 signed statements that turned her assault into a crime she'd committed, about a system that had looked at her terror and decided it wasn't worth investigating because the wrong person had money. She took his hand. The system failed Stacy because her attacker was rich. If you believe justice shouldn't have a price tag, smash the like button. Let's show them we don't support bought and paid for justice. The safe house wasn't what Stacy expected. She'd imagined something out of a crime thriller. A warehouse with boarded windows, a basement with concrete walls, maybe a motel on the edge of town where the neon sign flickered and nobody asked questions. Instead, Antonio drove her to a renovated brownstone in the historic district, the kind of neighborhood where doctors and architects raised families behind wrought iron gates and oak trees older than the city itself provided shade that felt like protection. "This is yours?" Stacy asked, as Antonio unlocked the front door, punching a code into a security panel that looked more sophisticated than anything she'd seen outside of airport checkpoints. "One of several," he said, stepping aside to let her enter first. "The Hargraves will check my known properties, the club, my apartment downtown, the warehouse on 5th. They won't think to look here. This is registered under a shell company that's buried under 3 other shell companies. It doesn't exist on paper in any way that connects to me." The interior was beautiful in an understated way. Hardwood floors that gleamed in the ambient lighting, furniture that looked comfortable but expensive, the kind that aged gracefully instead of falling apart. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with titles in multiple languages. A kitchen visible through an archway, all stainless steel and black granite. It looked like a home, like somewhere a person lived, not just hid. "There's a bedroom upstairs," Antonio said, setting his keys on a console table near the door. "Second door on the left, bathrooms attached. There are clothes in the closet that should fit. I keep supplies here for situations like this." "Situations like this?" Stacy's voice came out sharper than she intended. "How often do you have to hide women from men whose faces you've rearranged?" Antonio met her eyes. "Often enough that I'm prepared for it." The honesty was somehow worse than a lie would have been. Stacy sank onto the couch, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache. Her hands were still shaking, a tremor that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with delayed shock finally catching up with her system. Antonio disappeared into the kitchen. She heard cabinet doors opening, the sound of glass, water running. He returned with 2 glasses and a bottle of whiskey that looked older than both of them combined. He poured without asking, handed her 1 glass, and took the other for himself. "Drink," he said. "It won't fix anything, but it'll take the edge off." Stacy drank. The whiskey burned going down, settled warm in her stomach, and immediately started working on the knot of tension that had been tightening in her chest since Julian's hand first grabbed her wrist. She took another sip, then another. Antonio watched her without judgment, just waited until she'd finished half the glass, and the shaking in her hands had subsided to something manageable. "I froze," Stacy said suddenly, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "On the table. When he grabbed me, I just froze. I didn't fight. I didn't scream. I just lay there like some helpless—" "You survived," Antonio interrupted, his voice firm. "That's what you did. You survived. By doing nothing. By doing exactly what kept you alive." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his glass dangling from his fingers. "You want to know what happens to women who fight back against men like Julian? In rooms like that, with 5 of his friends watching and filming?" Stacy didn't answer. She didn't want to know. She already knew. "They get hurt worse," Antonio continued anyway. "They get broken in ways that don't heal. Because men like that, they're not looking for a challenge. They're looking for power. And when you take away their power by fighting back, they escalate. They prove they can hurt you worse than you can hurt them. You froze because your body understood something your mind didn't. That survival meant surrender. That fighting would have gotten you killed. So I'm supposed to just accept that? That the right choice was to lie there and take it? No. Antonio set his glass down, the sound sharp against the wood. You're supposed to understand that freezing kept you alive then, but fighting will keep you free now. There's a difference between reacting in the moment and choosing your battles after the moment has passed. You didn't have a choice on that table. You do now. Stacy looked at him. Really looked. At the scars on his knuckles, at the tattoos that covered stories he'd never tell. At the way he held himself like violence was a language he'd learned young and spoken fluently ever since. You're saying I should fight. I'm saying you already are. You took my hand tonight instead of running. That was the first choice. Now comes the second one. Do you want to hide until this blows over? Hope the Hargraves get bored and move on to easier targets? Or do you want to learn how to make sure you never freeze again? I don't know how to fight. I'm not... She gestured at him. At all of him. I'm not you. Good, Antonio said. The world doesn't need another me. But it needs you to stop thinking that kindness makes you weak. You froze because you're kind. Because you wanted to believe that men in expensive suits wouldn't really hurt you. That someone would intervene. That the rules you'd been taught about civilization and consequences still applied. He paused. They don't. Not for people like us. Not when we're up against people like them. So what do I do? Antonio stood, walked to the bookshelf, and pulled down a volume that looked like it had been read dozens of times. He opened it, flipped through pages until he found what he was looking for, and handed it to her. The text was in Italian. Stacy couldn't read it, but she recognized the illustrations, combat stances, defensive positions. The manual was old, the kind of thing that belonged in a museum, not a living room. My grandfather gave me this when I was 12, Antonio said. Right after my father died and I learned that the police weren't coming to help us, that we were on our own. He told me something I'm going to tell you now. Fear is a tool. It keeps you alive when you're weak. But if you stay afraid after you've learned to be strong, fear becomes a prison. You're still afraid, Stacy. That's good. That means you're smart. But I'm going to teach you how to use that fear instead of letting it use you. I'm not a fighter, Stacy repeated. But her voice had less certainty in it this time. You were never supposed to be. But Julian changed that when he decided you were prey. Now you get to decide if you stay prey or become something else. He took the book back, closed it gently, returned it to the shelf. Tomorrow, we start training. Not to turn you into me, but to make sure that if you ever end up on another table, with another Julian, you don't freeze. You don't wait for someone else to save you. You save yourself. Stacy finished her whiskey. The burn had faded to warmth. Her hands had stopped shaking entirely now. She felt something shifting inside her chest. Something that had been locked tight since she was a child and learned that the world was cruel to people who couldn't afford armor. It wasn't courage. Not yet. But it was something adjacent to it. Something that might grow into courage if she fed it right. What if I can't? She asked quietly. What if I freeze again? Then I'll be there until you don't, Antonio said simply. That's what protection means. Not that you'll never face danger, but that you won't face it alone. Not anymore. He stood, collected both glasses, and headed toward the kitchen. At the doorway, he paused. The bedroom's yours. Door locks from the inside. No one's coming through it without your permission, not even me. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we see if you're really ready to stop running. He left her alone in the living room with the books and the ambient light and the understanding that everything had changed. That she wasn't the same woman who'd walked into the Velvet Lounge's back room. That woman had frozen, had surrendered, had waited to be saved. The woman sitting on this couch, in this safe house, drinking whiskey that cost more than her rent. She wasn't sure who she was yet, but she knew who she didn't want to be anymore. Stacy stood, climbed the stairs, found the bedroom exactly where Antonio said it would be. The clothes in the closet fit perfectly. The bed was soft. The lock on the door clicked with a solid, reassuring sound. She lay down in the darkness and thought about fear, about freezing, about the difference between surviving and being free. And for the first time since Julian's hand had grabbed her wrist, Stacy closed her eyes without seeing his face. Instead, she saw Antonio's scarred knuckles, the Italian combat manual, the promise that she wouldn't face this alone. She fell asleep planning her first punch. The call came at 2:17 in the morning, 6 days after Stacy had moved into the safe house. She'd been dreaming about the table, about pointing fingers. But in the dream she was standing, not lying down, and her hands weren't shaking. Antonio's phone vibrated on the nightstand downstairs where he'd fallen asleep on the couch, still dressed, his gun within reach like it always was. He answered before the second ring. "It's Marco," the voice on the other end said, tight with urgency. "They're here. 8 of them. Maybe more. Professional. Not cops. Not Hargrave's usual security. These are contractors. Military." Antonio was already moving, sliding his weapon into the holster at his hip, grabbing his jacket. "How long?" "They hit the front 2 minutes ago. Breached the locks like they were paper. We're holding the main floor, but they're pushing toward the back." "Boss, they're not here to vandalize. They're here to send a message written in bodies. Get everyone out. Staff, customers, everyone. Use the kitchen exit. I'm 10 minutes away. They'll burn it before you get here. Then let them burn it. I can rebuild a club. I can't rebuild people." He ended the call and took the stairs 3 at a time. Stacy was already in the doorway of her bedroom, wearing the black tactical pants and fitted shirt he'd given her 3 days ago when the training started. Her hair was pulled back. Her eyes were alert, focused. 6 days of learning how to fall, how to strike, how to move through space like it owed her something instead of the other way around hadn't made her a fighter. Not yet, but it had made her someone who didn't freeze. "They're hitting the club," Antonio said, his voice clipped and efficient. "You stay here. Doors locked. Don't answer for anyone except me. If someone else tries to get in, there's a panic room behind the bookshelf. Code is your birthday backwards." "No," Stacy said. Antonio paused, one hand on the banister. "This isn't a discussion." "You're right. It's not." She came down the stairs, her steps measured and deliberate. "I worked that club for a month. I know every hallway, every storage room, every exit that's not on the blueprint because someone cut a door 20 years ago and never reported it. You're walking into a building you own but I lived in. You need me. I need you alive. Then keep me that way. But I'm going." She crossed her arms. "You said I get to choose my battles now. This is mine." Antonio stared at her for 3 full seconds, his jaw working, calculation happening behind his eyes. Then he moved to the hall closet, opened it, and pulled out a second holster. Smaller. The gun inside was compact, matte black, the kind of weapon designed to be concealed and effective. He checked the magazine, chambered around, and held it out to her. "Safety's here. You point, you squeeze. You don't stop squeezing until the threat stops moving. You understand?" Stacy took the weapon. It was heavier than she expected, colder, real in a way that made her training suddenly feel inadequate. "I understand. If I tell you to run, you run. No arguments, no heroics." "Agreed?" "Agreed." They made it to the Velvet Lounge in 8 minutes. Antonio drove like he was negotiating with physics and winning. The streets were empty at this hour, the city holding its breath between last call and first light. Smoke was already visible from 2 blocks away, thick and black, pouring from the upper windows where Antonio's office had been. Fire. They'd started with fire. Antonio parked 3 streets over, and they approached on foot, moving through alleys Stacy hadn't known existed. The front of the club was chaos. Staff streaming out of the kitchen exit, some of them crying, others just running. Fire trucks in the distance, their sirens getting closer but not close enough. And in the doorway, silhouetted against the flames inside, 4 men in tactical gear, body armor, night vision goggles pushed up on their heads, rifles held with the casual competence of people who'd done this professionally in countries where it was legal. "Contractors," Antonio confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hargrave hired mercenaries. He's not just trying to scare me anymore. He's trying to erase me. How do we—" Antonio held up a hand, listened, then pointed toward the side of the building where the fire escape zigzagged up the brick. "They'll have men inside. Probably 2 holding the back room. 2 more sweeping for anyone who didn't evacuate. They're expecting me to come through the front like an idiot. We're going up." They climbed. The metal was hot already from the fire spreading through the 2nd floor. Stacy's hands burned where she gripped the rungs, but she didn't slow down. At the 3rd floor window, Antonio stopped, tested the frame, found it unlocked. He went through first, weapon up, scanning corners with the efficiency of someone who'd cleared rooms before civilization had a word for it. Inside, the smoke was thicker. It clung to the ceiling like a living thing, black and toxic. Stacy pulled her shirt over her nose and mouth, her eyes already watering. They moved through what used to be the storage level, past boxes of liquor and linens, toward the stairwell that led down to the main floor. That's when they heard the voices. "Nothing up here. Place is empty. Let's finish it and get out before the fire department shows up. Boss said make sure Ramirez sees what happens when you disrespect a Hargrave. Burn it slow. Make it hurt. Antonio held up 2 fingers. 2 targets. He moved to the edge of the stairwell, looked down, and Stacy saw his jaw tighten. Bad angles, no clean shots. The mercenaries were positioned too well, covering each other's blind spots like they'd rehearsed this exact scenario. Stacy tapped his shoulder. When he turned, she pointed toward the wall, toward a section that looked solid but she knew wasn't. The old dumbwaiter shaft. It hadn't been used in decades, sealed over with drywall and paint, but the shaft still ran from the storage level straight down to the kitchen. She'd found it her 2nd week on the job, noticed the seam where the wall had been patched, asked the day manager about it. Antonio understood immediately. He found the edge of the drywall, used his knife to score the paint, and pulled. The panel came away with barely a sound, revealing darkness and a shaft just wide enough for a person to fit. Barely. You can't, Stacy whispered. You're too... I know, Antonio said, and looked at her. Really looked at her. But you're not. Stacy's heart slammed against her ribs. This wasn't the plan. This wasn't staying safe. This was the opposite of everything he'd told her to do. Down the shaft, Antonio continued, his voice urgent but controlled. It opens into the kitchen. You'll come out behind them. They're focused on the main floor, on the front entrance. They won't expect someone from their 6. You don't have to shoot them. Just make noise. Break something. Get their attention. When they turn, I'll have clean angles from up here. And if they shoot me first, then I'll kill them before they get a 2nd shot. But they won't, because you're going to move like I taught you. Fast, purposeful, like you own the space. Stacy looked at the shaft, at the darkness, at the drop that probably ended badly if she slipped. Then she looked at Antonio, at this man who'd broken men for her, who'd taught her that freezing was survival but fighting was freedom, who was now asking her to prove she'd learned the difference. She handed him her gun. I'll need both hands. Stacy, I'm not helpless anymore. You taught me that. Now let me prove it. She slid into the shaft before he could argue. The space was claustrophobic, the walls close enough that her shoulders scraped both sides. She could feel the heat from the fire somewhere above, could hear the crackle of wood giving way to flame. Hand over hand, foot searching for purchase on the ancient metal rungs that were still bolted into the shaft walls. Down into darkness that smelled like smoke and rust and fear. The shaft ended in the kitchen. She could see light through the slats of the old dumbwaiter door, hear voices closer now. 2 men. One of them was describing how much accelerant they'd used on the 2nd floor. The other was laughing. Stacy braced her feet against the sides of the shaft, positioned her hands on the dumbwaiter door, and thought about Julian's face. About the pointing fingers. About 6 days of Antonio teaching her that her body was a weapon if she decided to make it one. She kicked the door open and came out screaming. Not from fear. From fury. The mercenaries spun, rifles coming up, but she was already moving. She grabbed the industrial mixer on the counter and hurled it at the closer one. 60 pounds of stainless steel caught him in the chest. He went down hard. The second one tracked her with his rifle but hesitated, just for a second, confused by the small woman who should have been terrified but was instead advancing on him with a kitchen knife she'd grabbed from the block. That second was all Antonio needed. The shot came from above, clean, professional. The mercenary dropped without a sound, a red flower blooming on his tactical vest where armor didn't cover his throat. Stacy stood in the kitchen, breathing hard, the knife shaking in her hand. The mercenary she'd hit with the mixer was groaning, trying to get up. Antonio appeared at the doorway, weapon still raised, his eyes scanning for additional threats. Clear, he said. Then he looked at Stacy. You good? She wasn't. Her hands were shaking again. Her vision was swimming. She'd just participated in violence that would give her nightmares for years. But she was standing. She hadn't frozen. She'd made the choice to fight, and she'd survived it. I'm good, she said. Outside, the fire trucks had arrived. Inside, the fire was spreading, consuming everything Antonio had built. But they were alive, together, and the siege had failed. Julian Hargrave was hiding in his family's summer estate when Antonio found him. Not the main house, the one listed in public records with the limestone facade and the circular driveway that appeared in architectural magazines. The other one, the hunting lodge 40 miles north, tucked into woods so thick the nearest neighbor was a mile away, and didn't ask questions because the Hargraves paid them not to. It took Antonio 3 days to locate him. 3 days of leveraging contacts, calling in favors from people who owed him blood debts, tracing credit card transactions and cell phone pings, and the kind of digital breadcrumbs that people with money thought they could hide but really just made more expensive. Julian had been careful. He'd used his mother's cards, had someone else make the reservations, had driven up in a rental under a fake name. But careful wasn't the same as invisible. Not when Antonio had spent 30 years learning how to find people who didn't want to be found. Stacy came with him. He'd argued against it for an hour, listed every reason why she should stay at the safe house, behind locks and security systems and distance. She'd listened patiently, then said 6 words that ended the discussion. He pointed his finger at me. That finger, that gesture in the back room when Julian's friends had mocked her, that casual cruelty of turning her assault into entertainment. She'd earned the right to see how the story ended. They arrived just after midnight. No moon, the woods dark as a held breath. The lodge glowed warm in the clearing, smoke rising from the chimney, light spilling from the windows in golden rectangles that promised safety, comfort, the illusion that money could still protect him. 2 cars in the driveway. Julian's rental and a black SUV that probably belonged to private security. Hargrave Sr. had learned from the club attack. This time he'd sent someone to babysit his son. Antonio parked a 1/4 mile down the access road, and they walked the rest of the way through the trees. Stacy moved quietly now, her footsteps measured, her breathing controlled. 6 days of training and 1 night of real violence had taught her body new languages. She wasn't a soldier, but she wasn't prey anymore either. She was something in between, something that had learned to hunt. The security guard was on the back porch, smoking a cigarette, his rifle leaning against the railing within easy reach. 40-something, fit, alert, former military from the way he held himself, scanning the tree line every 20 seconds like clockwork. Professional. Antonio watched him for 5 minutes, timing his patterns, finding the rhythm. When the guard turned to flick his cigarette into the yard, Antonio moved. Silent. Fast. An arm around the throat, pressure applied to the carotid artery with surgical precision. The guard struggled for 4 seconds, then went limp. Antonio lowered him to the deck, zip-tied his wrists and ankles, gagged him with his own shirt. He'd wake up in 20 minutes with a headache and a story he'd be too embarrassed to tell. The back door was unlocked. Of course it was. Men like Julian didn't lock doors when they had guards to do their worrying for them. Antonio entered first, weapon drawn, Stacy behind him covering angles he'd taught her to watch. The lodge was exactly what she expected. Leather furniture, mounted deer heads, a stone fireplace big enough to roast a pig, money pretending to be rustic, privilege dressed as wilderness survival. They found Julian in the upstairs bedroom, sitting in an armchair facing the door like he'd been expecting them. He wasn't alone. Richard Hargrave sat across from him, a crystal tumbler in his hand, his face carved from the same expensive granite as his son's. But older, harder, more used to winning. Ramirez, Richard said, not standing, breaking and entering. Assault on private security. I'm counting at least 5 felonies so far. Keep going. Make it 10. My lawyers love billable hours. Antonio ignored him. His eyes were on Julian, on the face that had healed wrong from their last meeting. The nose had been reset but sat crooked now, a scar cut through his eyebrow where stitches had pulled tight. His left eye drooped slightly from nerve damage that plastic surgery couldn't fix. He looked like what he was, a man who'd learned that actions had consequences and hated the lesson. You burned my club, Antonio said quietly. I've no idea what you're talking about, Julian replied, but his voice shook. I've been here for days. Witnesses, alibis. Whatever happened in the city has nothing to do with me. 8 mercenaries, military contractors. They tried to trap me inside while it burned. Would have worked too, except I had help. Antonio gestured to Stacy. You remember her, the waitress, the one you put on the table. Julian's eyes flicked to Stacy, then away. Fast. Like looking at her hurt. That was a misunderstanding. We were drunk. Things got out of hand. I apologized. No, Stacy said, her voice cutting through the room like glass. You didn't. You pointed at me and laughed and told your friends to film it. That's not a misunderstanding. That's assault. That's entertainment to you. Richard set down his glass. My son has made mistakes. We've acknowledged that. We've offered compensation, financial settlements, non-disclosure agreements. Everything can be resolved civilly if you'd simply been willing to negotiate instead of resorting to barbarism. You paid off the police, Antonio said. You had them write up statements that made her the criminal. You sent mercenaries to kill me in my own building. That's not negotiation. That's war. And you lost. We haven't lost anything. Richard stood now, his posture radiating the confidence of a man who'd never faced real consequences. You've lost a club. We can take everything else. Your properties, your accounts, your reputation. We can bury you in litigation until you're defending yourself in court for the next 20 years. Or we can end this. Right now, you walk away, we walk away. Everyone forgets this unpleasantness. Antonio smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. I'm not here to negotiate with you. He turned to Julian. You get a choice. One choice. Leave the city. Tonight. Drive until you hit a state line. Then keep driving. Change your name. Start over somewhere your father's money can protect you from everyone except yourself. Do that. And you live. Stay. And you don't. Julian's face flushed red. You can't threaten me in my own. I'm not threatening. I'm offering. There's a difference. Antonio took a step closer. I know what you are. I know about the girls before Stacy. The ones your father paid to stay quiet. The one in Boston who took the settlement and still has nightmares. The one in New York who tried to press charges until your lawyers made her life hell. You're not a mistake. You're a pattern. And patterns don't change unless someone breaks them. Richard moved toward the desk where a phone sat. Antonio's gun came up, not aimed at Richard but at the phone. Don't. You'd shoot an unarmed man in front of a witness? She's not a witness. She's a survivor. There's a difference. Antonio kept his weapon steady. This ends tonight, Julian. You choose how. For a long moment, nobody moved. The fire crackled downstairs. The wind moved through the trees outside, and Julian sat in his chair, his face cycling through expressions. Fear, rage, calculation, desperation. Stacy watched him and recognized something in his eyes. The same look she'd seen on that table. Not remorse, not shame, just anger that someone had finally told him no. Julian stood slowly, his hands raised. Fine, you win. I'll leave. Tonight. You'll never see me again. Julian. Richard started, but his son shook his head. It's over, Dad. He's right. We lost. Julian moved toward the door, his path taking him past Antonio, past Stacy. He paused when he reached her, looked at her face for the first time since that night. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. The words might have meant something if his hand hadn't been moving toward his jacket pocket. Stacy saw it before Antonio did. The subtle shift in Julian's weight. The way his shoulder dropped. The same calculating look she'd seen when he'd grabbed her wrist that first time. He was going for a weapon. A gun. A knife. Something his father had given him for protection that he was going to use one last time because men like Julian didn't apologize. They retaliated. Her training kicked in faster than thought. 6 days of Antonio teaching her that hesitation killed. She drew the compact weapon from her holster, the motion smooth, practiced, no longer foreign. She didn't think. She just acted. The shot was loud in the enclosed space. Julian stumbled backward, his hand still reaching, his eyes wide with surprise. He hit the wall and slid down slowly, leaving a red smear on the expensive wood paneling. The gun he'd been reaching for fell from his pocket, small and silver and loaded. Richard Hargrave screamed. Not words, just sound. The primal noise of a father watching his son die. He lunged toward Julian, toward the spreading pool, but Antonio caught him, held him back with one arm while his other hand still held his weapon. Stacy stood frozen, her gun still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. She was shaking again, not from fear, from the weight of what she'd just done, of who she'd just become. Antonio looked at her, then at Julian's body, then at Richard. Self-defense, he said calmly. He reached for a weapon. She defended herself. That's what happened. That's what you'll tell everyone who asks. Because if you don't, if you try to spin this any other way, I'll release every piece of evidence I have about every girl your son hurt, every settlement, every NDA, every time you paid someone to keep quiet. I'll burn the Hargrave name so thoroughly that your grandchildren will change their last names to escape it. Richard said nothing. He just stared at his son's body, tears streaming down his face, all the power and money and influence suddenly meaningless against the permanence of death. Antonio guided Stacy toward the door. She moved mechanically, her eyes still on Julian, on the blood, on the consequences of her choice. They walked down the stairs, through the lodge, past the guard who was starting to wake up on the back porch, into the woods, into the car, into the night that would carry them away from the place where Julian Hargrave learned his final lesson. Julian thought he could hurt people and walk away laughing. If you believe that actions should have consequences, comment "justice served" below. Don't let the bad guys think they won. 7 months later, the Velvet Lounge reopened under a winter sky that threatened snow but never delivered. The fire had gutted the second and third floors, left the back room a charred skeleton of what it had been. But Antonio had rebuilt from the foundation up. New oak, new leather, new chandeliers that cast the same amber light but somehow felt different, cleaner, like the smoke had taken more than wood and fabric when it burned. It had taken the rot underneath. The sign above the entrance was the same, the velvet curtains identical. But the club itself had changed in ways that weren't visible from the street. New security protocols, cameras in every room, their feeds monitored from a central station where 2 former military contractors, the kind who worked for Antonio now, instead of against him, watched screens like hawks. Background checks on every customer who wanted access to the private rooms. No more cash-only transactions. No more anonymous parties behind locked doors. No more spaces where men could mistake privacy for impunity. And standing behind the mahogany bar, her dark blonde hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail, wearing a black suit tailored to fit like armor, was Stacy Michaels. Not serving drinks, managing them. She moved through the club with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of the space, who'd earned the right to occupy it on her own terms. Her father's debts were paid, not by her. Antonio had handled that the same week she'd killed Julian Hargrave, made them disappear with the same efficiency he used to make problems disappear. She'd tried to refuse. He'd told her it wasn't a gift, it was a payment. Hazard compensation for the war she'd fought beside him. The club was busy tonight. Friday crowd, mostly regulars, people who understood that. The Velvet Lounge wasn't what it used to be. It was better now, safer, a place where the staff didn't flinch when customers raised their voices, where the women who worked there knew that the man in the white shirt at the back table would break anyone who confused hospitality with ownership. Antonio sat in his usual spot, the same corner where he'd sat the night Julian had made his fatal mistake. He looked the same, tattooed, massive, radiating controlled violence, but there were subtle differences. Gray threads in his hair that hadn't been there before. Lines around his eyes that came from rebuilding instead of destroying. He still owned the room, but now he shared it with someone else. Stacy caught his eye across the space. He nodded once. Their signal. Everything was running smoothly. She turned back to the bartender, approved his work, and moved toward the main floor where the Friday Jazz Quartet was setting up. That's when she saw it. Table 7. 3 men in business casual, their ties loosened, their laughter too loud for 9 o'clock. And standing beside them, holding a tray of drinks with white-knuckled hands, was Maya Chen, 22. 3rd week on the job, smart girl, pre-law at the State University, working nights to keep her scholarship viable. Stacy had hired her personally, had seen something familiar in the way Maya interviewed, desperate but determined, needing the job badly enough to ignore her instincts about what working in a place like this might cost. One of the men at table 7 had his hand on Maya's wrist. Not grabbing, not yet, but holding. His thumb pressed against her pulse point, feeling her heartbeat speed up, enjoying the power of it. He was saying something, his head tilted up, looking at her face instead of the drinks. Maya's smile was frozen in place, professional, but her eyes were wrong, too wide, too still. The same look Stacy had worn 7 months ago when Julian had first grabbed her. Stacy moved before thinking. Years ago, she would have hesitated, would have looked for a manager, would have hoped someone else would intervene. 6 days of training and 7 months of becoming someone new had erased that hesitation. She crossed the floor in 8 strides, her heels clicking against hardwood like a countdown. "Maya," Stacy said, her voice calm and clear. "I need you in the back. Inventory issue." The man holding Maya's wrist didn't let go. He looked up at Stacy, his eyes slightly unfocused from whatever he'd been drinking before he arrived. "We're in the middle of ordering. Your server will be back in 5 minutes. Someone else will take over. We want her." He squeezed Maya's wrist slightly. "She's perfect." Stacy felt something cold settle in her chest. The same cold she'd felt in the hunting lodge when Julian had reached for his weapon. She recognized this man's type. Not as wealthy as Julian had been. Not as confident, but the same core programming. The same belief that women in service positions existed to be possessed, not just served. "Sir," Stacy said, and her voice dropped half an octave. Took on the steel she'd learned from watching Antonio negotiate. You're going to remove your hand from my employee. Now, the man laughed. His friends joined in, the sound grating and performative. Or what? You'll call the manager? Baby, I've been coming here for 5 years. I know the owner. Tony and I go way back. It's Antonio, Stacy corrected. And you don't know him at all. Because if you did, you'd understand what happens to men who put their hands on women in this establishment without permission. Something in her tone must have registered because the man's grip loosened slightly. But he didn't let go. Pride wouldn't let him. Not in front of his friends. Not when backing down meant admitting he'd been wrong. Listen, sweetheart. Manager Michaels? Stacy interrupted. Not sweetheart, not baby. Manager Michaels. And this is your last opportunity to remove your hand before I remove it for you. The room had gone quiet. Not completely. The jazz quartet was still setting up. Customers were still talking, but a bubble of silence had formed around table 7. People were watching. Staff members had stopped moving. And at the back table, Antonio had stood up. He didn't walk over, didn't need to. He just stood there, all 6'4" of him, his presence filling the space like a storm front moving in. The message was clear. Whatever Stacy decided to do next, she had the full weight of his authority behind her. This wasn't a manager handling a difficult customer. This was a protected woman protecting another woman, backed by a man who'd already proven he'd burn his own club down before letting history repeat itself. The man at table 7 saw Antonio, really saw him, the tattoos visible beneath rolled sleeves, the scars on his knuckles, the way other customers were giving him space like he was radioactive. The man's face went pale. His hand dropped from Maya's wrist like he'd been burned. We were just talking, he said, his voice suddenly smaller. Just being friendly. Friendly doesn't require physical contact, Stacy replied. Maya, head to the back, take 15, get some water. Maya nodded, her eyes grateful, and disappeared toward the kitchen. Stacy turned her attention back to the table. Your bill will be settled. You're not being charged for anything you've consumed tonight. But you're done here. Permanently. Our security will escort you out. You can't. I can. I am. And if you come back, if you try to contact any member of my staff, if you even drive past this building, you'll answer to him. She gestured toward Antonio, who was now moving closer, his approach unhurried but inevitable. And trust me, you don't want that conversation. The 3 men left. Fast. They didn't argue, didn't demand to speak to someone higher up, didn't try to flex whatever connections they thought they had. They just went, collected by security and guided out through the front door like garbage being taken to the curb. Stacy watched them go, her heart hammering but her hands steady. She felt Antonio arrive beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. You handled that well, he said quietly. I learned from the best. She looked up at him. Think they'll come back? No. Men like that only push boundaries where they think they're safe. You just showed them they're not safe here, that this club protects its own now. Stacy nodded, then went to check on Maya in the back. She found her in the break room, sitting on the couch, hands wrapped around a water bottle, still shaking slightly. I'm sorry, Maya said immediately. I should have handled that better. I just froze. Don't apologize. Stacy sat beside her. Freezing is what kept you safe. Fighting back would have made him escalate. You did exactly what you needed to do to survive that moment. But here's what you need to know. You don't have to just survive anymore. Not here. Anyone puts their hands on you without permission, you come find me. Immediately. You understand? Maya's eyes were wet, but she nodded. Thank you. I didn't think anyone would actually. I know. Stacy squeezed her shoulder. I know exactly what you thought. Because I used to think the same thing. But this isn't that place anymore. This is somewhere different. Somewhere safer. She stood, straightened her jacket, and walked back to the main floor. The club had returned to its rhythm. The jazz quartet had started playing. Customers were laughing, drinking, enjoying the ambiance. But underneath it all, something had shifted. A message had been sent. A line had been drawn. And everyone who'd witnessed it understood that the Velvet Lounge was no longer a golden cage where women endured in silence. Antonio was back at his table, but he was watching her. Always watching. Not as an owner monitoring an employee, but as a partner ensuring the vision they'd built together, the one that had cost them both so much, stayed intact. Stacy met his eyes across the room and saw something that might have been pride or respect, or simply recognition that she'd become exactly what he'd promised she could be. Someone who didn't freeze anymore. She turned back to her work. Moving through the club, she now helped command, head high, shoulders back, no longer a waitress hoping to survive the night. She was the gatekeeper now, the one who decided who stayed and who went. The one who broke the cycle so no one else would have to lie on a table and wonder if anyone would save them. The velvet curtain swayed slightly in the breeze from the open door. The oak tables gleamed under the amber lights. And in the back room, the newly rebuilt back room, where the wood still smelled of fresh varnish, there was a small brass plaque mounted on the wall where only staff would see it. No one touches what's ours. No one ever again. The velvet lounge had reopened. But it had become something new. Something that remembered its scars and used them as armor. A place where the broken rebuilt themselves into weapons, and where the cycle of abuse ended not with laws or courts or systems that failed, but with two people who decided that enough was finally enough. Stacy Michaels, once a victim on a table, now walked through her kingdom and knew with absolute certainty she would never freeze again.